Kira Pierce sat in her car, fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the store ahead. The rain came down in thin, steady lines, tapping against the windshield like impatient fingers. She barely recognized it. Through the blurry glass, the once proud Pierce & Company storefront looked tired. Its bright red logo faded, its windows streaked with grime that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. Kira's reflection in the rearview mirror was just as unrecognizable. Gone was the polished CEO, the woman whose tailored suits and power heels had once graced the covers of regional business magazines. In her place sat Mark, a middle-aged trainee with boxy glasses, a salt-and-pepper wig, and a weathered navy rain jacket zipped up to his neck. The makeup artist had even added subtle wrinkles around her mouth and eyes, lines she didn't actually have yet, but somehow they felt fitting. She exhaled slowly, tracing her thumb over the steering wheel. This was where it had all started. The first Pierce & Cober store, store number 001. She had opened it 20 years ago, standing proudly beside her first ever hire, a wide-eyed young woman named Nancy Jenkins. Nancy had been fresh out of high school then, eager to work her way up. That day, Kira had stood in front of the store with her then 5-year-old daughter perched on her hip, cutting the red ribbon with hands that trembled with excitement and fear. Now 2 decades and 11 more stores later, Kira realized she hadn't set foot inside this particular location for almost 3 years. She had become a CEO who knew the stores by spreadsheets, not by the heartbeat of the floor. And that heartbeat was failing. Customer complaints had spiked. Employee turnover at store number 001 was the highest in the district. Yet every time she confronted her regional managers, they fed her the same sugary nonsense. Everything's fine, just a few bumps. But Kira knew better. Numbers don't lie, and neither does the gut instinct of a woman who once spent weekends stocking shelves and counting registers herself. The rain intensified, blurring the world outside into a grayish smear, but Kira could still make out a familiar figure through the glass doors. Debbie Simmons. Even from across the parking lot, Kira could recognize her posture. Arms crossed, jaw tight, shoulders angled forward like a battering ram. Debbie had started as a cashier in store number 003 years ago, rising quickly through the ranks with impressive numbers and a take-no-prisoners attitude. She was exactly the type of manager corporate once applauded. But Kira knew numbers weren't everything. A sharp knock on the passenger window jolted her back. Kira's heart jumped, but it was just a teenager darting by with a soaked backpack. Time to move. She tugged her hood up, stepped into the rain, and crossed the parking lot toward the door. Inside, the first thing she saw was a cashier wiping tears from her face, and Debbie's voice slicing through the air like a knife. Kira froze just inside the door, rain dripping off her jacket and pooling onto the scuffed tile floor. The air inside the store felt dense, charged with the kind of tension that settles into places where people are afraid to breathe too loudly. At the front register, a young cashier, Maya Rodriguez, if Kira remembered the name correctly, stood with trembling hands, trying to ring up a customer's order. Her eyes were red, her mascara smudged, and her voice was barely above a whisper as she apologized for the 3rd time. "Sorry, ma'am, Sorry doesn't fix anything." Debbie's voice cut through the silence like a whip. She stood less than 3 feet from Maya, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles went white. "You've been here long enough to know how to handle a simple transaction. Or is that too much for you?" Maya flinched, her gaze locked on the scanner in front of her. Kira's stomach twisted. She had seen plenty of managers lose their temper, but there was something about Debbie's tone, a sharp, calculated cruelty that sent a chill through her. This wasn't just tough love or high standards. This was personal. The customer, an older woman in a raincoat, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. A few aisles away, Lincoln Nguyen, the stockroom clerk Kira had seen on several reports, paused with a box of detergent in his hands. He stood perfectly still, as though moving might make him the next target. Kira resisted every instinct screaming at her to step in. Not yet. This was recon. She had come to see the truth with her own eyes, and that meant staying invisible, at least for now. She approached the customer service counter, keeping her head down, playing the role of the awkward new trainee. Debbie barely glanced at her. "You must be Mark," she muttered, shoving a flimsy name tag toward Kira. "Stay out of the way and don't screw anything up." It was a welcome Kira had never imagined would happen inside a store with her name on the sign. For the next half hour, she moved through the store quietly, watching more than working. She saw Maya retreat to the break room after her shift ended, sitting alone with her head in her hands. She saw Lincoln working 2 speeds faster than anyone else, filling shelves and helping customers with quiet efficiency. She saw Debbie barking orders from the front, barely lifting a finger to help, and sneaking into the office every time a phone call came in. Every piece of it added up to a picture Kira didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. By the time her training shift ended, Kira felt heavier than when she walked in. This wasn't just a bad day. This was a culture problem, rotting the store from the inside out. She stepped outside into the rain once again, but this time the cold felt sharper, cutting through her disguise and sinking into her bones. Tomorrow she would return, not as CEO, but as a ghost walking through the wreckage she had unknowingly helped create. The next morning, Kira arrived 15 minutes before the store opened. The sky was still overcast, the pavement wet from last night's rain, but the air carried a sharpness that made her feel awake, more awake than she had felt in a long time. She stood outside for a moment, studying the building. The Pierce & Company sign flickered slightly, one of the bulbs half dead. The front window still had a smudge from where someone had leaned their hand against the glass, and the cart return was overflowing, with a lone shopping cart tipped sideways like a forgotten soldier. This was her store, her first store, and yet it felt like a stranger. The metal door creaked open, and Lincoln stepped out, balancing a case of bottled water on his shoulder. His sneakers squeaked against the wet concrete, and Kira saw him wince slightly, adjusting the weight with practiced ease. "Morning," Kira said, her voice intentionally softer than usual, playing her part as the awkward new hire. Lincoln gave a small nod. "You're early, that's good. Debbie hates late people." He disappeared back inside before Kira could respond. By the time she entered, the fluorescent lights had flickered to life, casting a pale glow over the shelves. Maya was already at her register, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, dark circles still faint under her eyes. She offered Kira a shy smile, then quickly looked away when Debbie stormed in from the back office. Debbie's heels clacked against the tile like gunfire. "All right, listen up," she barked, gathering the morning shift into a tight huddle near customer service. "Corporate's been breathing down my neck about sales numbers, so today we're pushing clearance items at every register. No excuses." Kira watched as the employees exchanged wary glances. Nobody spoke. "Mark," Debbie said, turning to Kira, "you're stalking today. Don't screw it up." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the break room, already barking into her cell phone. Kira headed to the stockroom, Lincoln already waiting inside, sorting boxes with fast, efficient hands. "She's in a mood," Kira said quietly. Lincoln snorted. "When isn't she?" There was no malice in his voice, just resignation. Kira grabbed a box cutter and started opening cartons beside him. "Is it always like this?" Lincoln hesitated, as if deciding how much to say. "Pretty much. Used to be better before. I mean, when I started, it felt more like, I don't know, like we were all part of something." He shrugged. "Now? You just keep your head down and survive the shift." Kira's chest tightened at the words. This wasn't just bad management. This was cultural decay. She worked alongside Lincoln for the next hour, hands moving automatically while her mind churned through every choice she had made over the past decade. Somewhere along the way, she had lost the heart of what Pierce and Company was meant to be. Kira kept working, slicing through cardboard and stacking inventory, but her thoughts spun faster than her hands. Every time Lincoln answered a question or made a comment, it revealed something deeper, something more broken than just a bad day or a stressed manager. It wasn't only fear she saw in Lincoln, it was detachment. Like he had already accepted that work meant surviving, not thriving. That mindset didn't come from nowhere. It came from culture, and culture came from leadership. Leadership like hers. Outside the stockroom, Debbie's voice carried through the store, barking orders with her signature edge. Every instruction felt less like guidance and more like a threat wrapped in thinly disguised authority. Lincoln barely reacted, his body already conditioned to tune it out. Kira couldn't ignore it. This wasn't just harsh management. It was a culture of submission, of keeping your head low to avoid becoming a target. At one point, Maya passed by the stockroom door, her hands gripping a small stack of clearance stickers so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked up just long enough to offer Kira a polite smile, but her eyes gave her away. There was no spark, no sense of pride in her work. Just exhaustion layered with quiet fear. The kind Kira knew too well from her own past. The kind she thought her company would never foster. When Kira started Pierce and Company, she had promised herself it would be different. It would be the kind of workplace where people felt seen, heard, respected. A place where hard work wasn't just rewarded, but celebrated. Somehow, somewhere between expanding the chain and chasing quarterly targets, she had let that promise slip away. And now, that dream stood cracked and discolored in front of her, wrapped in clearance stickers and corporate memos about upselling policies. As the morning crept toward lunch, Kira found herself drifting closer to the front of the store. She watched Debbie handle a return with her usual mix of fake charm and underlying hostility, her smile so tight it barely touched her eyes. The customer, a middle-aged woman with a toddler tugging at her sleeve, asked a perfectly reasonable question about a discount, and Debbie's response was sharp enough to make the woman physically step back. Kira caught Lincoln watching too, shaking his head subtly before turning away. Debbie didn't notice any of it, or maybe she didn't care. To her, this was just another transaction, another chance to assert her authority over both customer and staff. And that authority was built on fear, fear that trickled down into Maya's trembling hands, Lincoln's quiet resignation, and Kelsey's refusal to make eye contact. This wasn't leadership, it was control. Kira saw it now, painfully clear, and the worst part was knowing that she had built the system that allowed it to happen. When the lunch break rolled around, Kira found herself in the break room, alone with Maya. The silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the sound of Maya peeling the plastic off a vending machine sandwich. Kira sat down across from her, feeling the weight of her disguise pressing against her chest. "Rough morning," Kira said gently, testing the waters. Maya gave a half-hearted nod, her fingers picking at the corner of her sandwich. "They're all kind of like this," she murmured. "You just get used to it." That sentence hit Kira harder than any corporate report ever had. People were getting used to being treated like this, in her store, under her name, inside the very company she had built to be better than the rest. The realization sat heavy in her stomach. Before Kira could respond, the door swung open and Debbie stood there, eyes narrowed, her phone clutched in one hand. "Break's over," she snapped at Maya. Then her gaze flicked to Kira. "And you, there's a spill in aisle 3. Clean it up, unless you're already planning to quit like the last guy." She didn't wait for an answer before leaving, her heels echoing down the hall. Maya hurried out, leaving Kira alone with the sound of the flickering fluorescent light overhead. Kira's hands curled into fists beneath the table. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fixed with one team meeting or a feel-good memo from corporate. This was cultural rot, and it would take something much bigger to turn it around. She stood up, tossing her untouched sandwich into the trash, and headed for aisle 3. Tomorrow, she would need to start digging deeper, not just into Debbie's behavior, but into the systems and expectations that had turned a store that once felt like family into a place where survival was the only goal. As Kira grabbed the mop, Lincoln passed by again, this time with a tired smile. "Welcome to the funhouse," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Kira smiled back, but inside her resolve tightened. She wasn't here to survive. She was here to dismantle the whole rotten foundation and build something worth believing in again. By the time Kira's second shift began, she had already mapped out the rhythms of the store. The ebb and flow of customers, the quiet moments where employees gathered near the stockroom to swap whispered complaints, and the tense silences that settled whenever Debbie walked through. It wasn't chaos, not exactly. It was something more subtle, more corrosive, a low-grade fear that had infected every corner of the store, coating the atmosphere like dust no one bothered to clean anymore. Kira kept her head down, stocking shelves in the snack aisle while her ears stayed open. The more she watched, the more patterns emerged. Debbie rarely stayed on the floor for more than 5 minutes at a time. She was always on her phone, calling who Kira didn't know yet. But her voice, sharp and clipped, floated out from the office every time Kira passed by. When she wasn't on the phone, she was lecturing Maya, always in public, always loud enough for customers to hear. It was less about correcting mistakes and more about making an example out of her. The rest of the staff had learned to stay invisible. Kelsey hovered near the fitting rooms, folding the same stack of clothes over and over to avoid drawing attention. Lincoln moved constantly, keeping his head down, never pausing long enough for Debbie to find fault. Even Nancy, steady and reliable Nancy, had perfected the art of blending into the background. Kira felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. The sheer, oppressive silence of people who had learned the safest way to survive was to stop being seen. And somehow, despite every leadership seminar and team-building initiative Kira had ever launched from her corporate office, this was the culture that had taken root in her first and most precious store. Shortly before noon, Kira caught her first real glimpse of what was happening behind the scenes. She had been asked to double-check the pricing gun in the stockroom when the door to Debbie's office swung halfway open. Inside, Debbie sat at the desk, her back to the door, one hand holding her phone to her ear, the other scrolling through what looked like a spreadsheet on her laptop. "I already adjusted the shrink numbers," Debbie said, her voice low but urgent. I'm not explaining to corporate why our markdown percentage spiked again. Kira stood perfectly still, heart thudding against her ribs. Adjusted? Shrink numbers weren't something you adjusted. They were supposed to reflect actual losses. Theft, damages, errors. Cooking those numbers meant either covering up theft or manipulating data to make the store look better than reality. Either way, it was a lie Kira couldn't ignore. She stepped back before Debbie noticed her, hands shaking slightly as she returned to the floor. For years, Kira had told herself that data told the real story. Sales reports, turnover rates, customer satisfaction scores. She had built her entire leadership philosophy on trusting the numbers. Now, standing in aisle 6, she realized the numbers had been lying to her all along. Kira forced herself to breathe slowly, steadying her hands as she faced the shelves in front of her. Pretending to straighten bags of chips, she let the truth settle in. Debbie wasn't just a bad manager. She was manipulating data to protect herself. And the worst part? Kira had no idea how long this had been happening, or how deep the rot had spread across her stores. The thought sent a cold shiver through her spine. If this was happening in her flagship location, the store Kira used to visit every weekend when her daughter was still in kindergarten, what was happening in the newer stores, the ones she barely knew beyond quarterly reports? She felt like a stranger in her own empire, a queen who had abandoned her kingdom for too long. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Debbie's heels clicking rapidly toward the front of the store. Kira glanced up just in time to see Debbie plastering on her fake customer service smile as a district manager from corporate, someone Kira recognized from Zoom calls but had never met in person, stepped through the front door. Kira quickly ducked behind a shelf, heart racing. This was a rare chance to observe how Debbie handled upper management when no one knew the CEO herself was watching. Debbie transformed in an instant. Her voice softened, almost syrupy, her laugh a little too loud. She walked the district manager, a man named Greg, through the store, bragging about how she had tightened up operations and held the team to higher standards. Every sentence made Kira's stomach churn. There was no mention of the screaming matches at the register, no mention of Maya's tears, no mention of employees quitting mid-shift just to escape the toxicity. Debbie painted a glossy, well-managed fantasy, one Kira might have believed had she been sitting comfortably in her corporate office miles away. When they passed by Lincoln near the frozen section, Debbie's smile flickered for half a second, just long enough for Kira to catch it. Lincoln offered a polite nod to Greg, but Kira saw the hesitation in his posture, the quiet fear that speaking too openly might cost him his job. Debbie knew it too, and the way her eyes hardened as Lincoln turned away told Kira everything. Debbie ruled by intimidation, not respect. As Greg moved on, Debbie lingered near the front, her phone still in hand. Kira inched closer, pretending to straighten a rack of sunglasses. That's when she heard it. Debbie's voice dropped low, just above a whisper, but clear enough for Kira to catch the words. Don't forget to clean up the numbers before next week's report. I need them to sparkle if I'm getting that bonus. Kira's stomach dropped. This wasn't just sloppy management. This was systemic fraud, designed to manipulate performance metrics and guarantee bonuses that weren't earned. And Kira, unknowingly, had probably signed off on those very bonuses. The weight of it hit hard, but there was no time to dwell. Across the store, Maya stood frozen at the register as a difficult customer began raising their voice, loud enough to turn heads. Debbie's head snapped up, irritation flashing in her eyes as she stormed toward the front. Kira knew what was coming. The public dressing down, the humiliation, the performance of power disguised as coaching. But this time, Kira was done watching. She stepped out from the sunglasses rack, crossed the floor, and took up a position just a few feet away from the register, close enough to hear every word and make sure Maya wasn't alone. Debbie stopped short when she saw Kira standing there, but she didn't recognize her. Not yet. To Debbie, Kira was still just Mark, the quiet trainee. And maybe, Kira thought, that was the perfect position to be in, for now. Because if Debbie was willing to fake numbers and humiliate staff with a district manager in the building, there was no telling what else she was hiding. And Kira was going to find out. The store felt colder after the district manager left, as if the thin veneer of professionalism had been peeled away, and all that remained was the raw tension underneath. Kira moved with purpose, using her trainee cover to roam more freely. She was no longer just observing employee morale. She was hunting for proof. Every shelf she restocked, every conversation she overheard, every quick glance she stole into Debbie's office became a piece of a larger puzzle. The fake numbers weren't an accident or an act of desperation. They were a strategy, a deliberate, calculated system built to keep Debbie untouchable. Kira saw it in the way inventory counts never matched what was actually on the shelves. She saw it in the way return policies were twisted, depending on who the customer was and how loudly they complained. But most of all, she saw it in the employees themselves. Maya flinching every time Debbie passed by. Lincoln avoiding the front of the store entirely when Debbie was working the floor. And Nancy, once the proud cornerstone of this location, keeping her head down like a woman waiting for retirement to save her. In the break room, Kira opened the ancient desktop computer sitting in the corner. The login screen flickered to life, and without hesitation, she typed in the generic manager password used across the chain. It worked. Debbie hadn't even bothered to change it. The system was clunky, a patchwork of outdated software Kira herself had once approved because it was cost-effective. Now, staring at the blinking cursor, she saw the real cost. The countless hours employees spent wrestling with slow reports, manual adjustments, and processes designed for head office, not for the reality of a store floor. She pulled up the last 6 months of inventory reports. The discrepancies screamed at her. Numbers adjusted without explanations, markdowns that didn't match sales patterns, and, most damning of all, a series of adjustments logged minutes before each corporate audit call. Kira swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. Debbie wasn't just covering up mistakes. She was actively shaping a narrative that made herself look like the only thing standing between the store and total collapse. If the store performed badly, Debbie could blame the staff. If the numbers looked good, Debbie took the credit. Either way, Debbie won. A noise at the door made Kira minimize the screen just as Lincoln stepped in, carrying a box of outdated promotional flyers. He looked surprised to see her there but said nothing, just dropped the box by the recycling bin. "You okay?" Kira asked softly, still playing her part. Lincoln shrugged. "Break room's safer than the floor when Debbie's in a mood." Kira didn't press. Trust would come slowly, especially in a place where survival depended on silence. But if she was going to fix this, she would need Lincoln and Maya and even Nancy to start believing that change was possible. Kira stayed in the break room for a few minutes after Lincoln left, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. The numbers didn't lie, but they also didn't tell the whole story. It wasn't just the fake reports or the manipulated shrink logs. It was the way those numbers had been weaponized against the team. Every performance review, every disciplinary write-up, every time Debbie had humiliated someone like Maya in front of customers, it all tied back to this. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was designed to protect Debbie at the cost of everyone beneath her. The door swung open again, this time with Nancy stepping in to grab her purse. She paused when she saw Kira still sitting there. "You're a hard worker," Nancy said, her tone neutral, but there was warmth beneath it, like she still wanted to believe there were good people left in the world. "Just trying to keep up," Kira answered with a small smile, slipping away from the computer and letting Nancy have the room to herself. Back on the floor, Kira watched the afternoon shift settle into its rhythm. Customers trickled in, some familiar, some new. Maya seemed quieter than usual, her shoulders slightly hunched every time she scanned an item. Kira couldn't tell if it was exhaustion or the crushing weight of always being watched, always waiting for the next verbal blow. Debbie's presence infected the entire store. Employees didn't just follow her orders, they anticipated her moods, adjusting their pace, their tone, their every move based on how loudly her heels clicked on the tile. It was survival instinct wrapped in customer service smiles. Near the back end cap, Kelsey was folding clearance sweaters with so much precision it bordered on obsession. Every corner aligned perfectly, every tag facing the same direction. Kira watched her hands shake slightly as Debbie passed, and it hit Kira harder than she expected. This girl wasn't lazy or careless. She was terrified. That fear was the root of everything Kira had seen so far. Fear of losing hours. Fear of being called out. Fear of being blamed for things beyond their control. And somewhere along the way, that fear had replaced pride. Kira grabbed a cart and started facing shelves, using the task as cover to drift closer to Debbie's office. The door was half open again, and this time, Kira heard her talking, not to corporate, but to another store manager. "I told you, you've got to control the narrative," Debbie said, her voice low and sharp. "If the numbers don't match corporate's fantasy, you make them match. That's how you keep your bonus, and that's how you keep your store." Kira's chest tightened. This wasn't just Debbie's personal strategy. It was a network of managers feeding off each other's fear, keeping up appearances to protect themselves at the expense of their teams. And worse, it was happening inside the company Kira had built, under a name that was supposed to stand for something better. Tomorrow, she would start peeling back more layers. But for now, all Kira could do was stand there, breathing through her anger, staring at the reflection of her name on the glass window beside her. Pierce and Company. It wasn't just a brand, it was her legacy. And somehow, she had let it become this. This wasn't just about saving one store anymore. This was about saving the soul of everything she'd built. The next morning, Kira walked into the store with a different kind of focus. Yesterday, she had come to observe. Today, she was here to push, just enough to crack the surface and see what leaked out. Real change couldn't happen until she knew exactly how deep the infection ran. And to do that, she needed to stop blending in and start disrupting the pattern. The day started like every other. Debbie barked out orders, Maya kept her head down, and Lincoln carried more weight than any one person should. Kira kept her movements deliberate, careful not to draw Debbie's attention just yet. But with every shelf she faced and every customer she assisted, she started asking small, pointed questions, the kind meant to stir the pot without tipping over the whole kettle. "Do we always rescan markdowns at the register? Or is there a system for that?" she asked Lincoln while helping him stock paper towels. Lincoln hesitated, shifting the box in his hands like it might give him the right answer. "Depends on the manager," he said finally. "Debbie likes to, clean things up before reports go out." He didn't say fudge the numbers, but Kira heard it all the same. Later, when Kira was assigned to help Maya at the front, she leaned in while they were between customers. "You're really fast with these price overrides," Kira said casually. "Is there a trick to it?" Maya gave a tired smile. "Debbie makes us practice. Says if the numbers don't match what corporate wants, it's our job to make them match." She said it like it was just part of the job, the same way someone might explain how to work a cash drawer or stack canned goods. That casual acceptance stung more than Kira expected. When had manipulation become just another skill set for her frontline workers? By noon, Kira knew she had enough to start connecting dots. But she wanted more than dots. She wanted proof, something undeniable she could hold up not just to Debbie, but to every regional manager who had let this culture fester under their noses. That meant getting into the safe. The safe held more than just cash. It held paper records, manual logs employees still filled out for certain inventory adjustments, return overrides, and special orders. Corporate might live and die by digital reports, but Kira knew from experience. The truth was often buried in handwritten margins and quiet notes scribbled by night crews too tired to remember they were supposed to cover tracks. But before she could get close, the front doors swung open and a customer stormed in, voice raised, demanding a manager. Every head in the store snapped up like they'd been trained to react to that particular pitch of anger. Maya's hands shook as she stepped forward, trying to smile through her nerves. Kira stood quietly beside her, watching, waiting, ready to act if Maya needed someone to stand between her and the next wave of humiliation. Maya's voice came out thin and uncertain. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" The woman, mid-50s, expensive haircut, the kind of customer who believed the customer is always right, gave her the right to be cruel, slapped a crumpled receipt down on the counter. "I bought these candles yesterday, and they were supposed to be half off. Your cashier charged me full price. What kind of scam are you running here?" Maya's fingers trembled as she picked up the receipt, trying to read the smeared ink through the condensation left from the rain outside. "I'm really sorry about that. Let me fix it for you." Before Maya could finish, Debbie's voice rang out from across the store. "Maya! What now?" The air thickened, the same way it had every time Debbie made a scene. Employees slowed their work, pretending not to listen but hanging on to every word. Kira could feel the shift in Maya's posture, the slight hunch, the way her shoulders drew inward like she was bracing for impact. Debbie marched to the register, her heels clicking like a countdown. Without asking any questions, she snatched the receipt from Maya's hand. "This is the second time this week, Maya. Are you even trying? How hard is it to ring up a sale?" Kira felt her stomach knot with rage, but she bit her tongue. Now wasn't the time to break cover. This needed to play out because this was the proof she needed. Not numbers, but culture in action. "Let me see the item," Debbie snapped, holding out her hand. Maya scrambled to retrieve the candles from the customer's bag, her fingers fumbling against the slippery plastic. One rolled off the counter and hit the floor with a dull thud. Debbie's sigh was loud enough to echo. Unbelievable. That was enough. Kira stepped forward, her hands resting lightly on the counter. "I can help," she said, keeping her tone level. Debbie's eyes flicked to her for the briefest second, dismissing her instantly. "New guy," Debbie muttered, waving her off. But Kira didn't step back. "Actually," she said, her voice a touch firmer, "I worked retail before this. Sometimes sale pricing doesn't sync right in the system when it's a rolling markdown. If it's okay, I can double-check the promo sheet in the back." Debbie's mouth opened, then closed. "Fine. Make yourself useful." Kira slipped into the back office, heart pounding, not just from anger but from the opportunity. While she flipped through the promo binder, her other hand reached for the safe log tucked into a side drawer. It was exactly what she expected, a mess of handwritten notes, price adjustments, and corrections, ordered by Debbie herself. Every override, every fake markdown, all in Debbie's handwriting. Kira snapped a quick photo with her phone, then returned to the front with the promo sheet in hand. "You were right," she told the customer, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The candles were supposed to be half off. We'll get that refund processed right now." Maya blinked, surprised, but grateful. Debbie stood stiffly beside the register, her smile brittle. "Glad we got that sorted." But Kira saw something flicker in Debbie's eyes. Recognition. For the first time, Debbie seemed to realize this new hire might be more than he appeared. The storm was coming, and Kira was ready to walk straight into it. The store felt different after the candle incident, subtle but undeniable. Employees were still walking on eggshells around Debbie, but something had shifted. For the first time, Maya had seen someone stand beside her instead of standing back, and for the first time, Debbie had hesitated. It wasn't much, but in a place where fear had ruled for so long, even the smallest crack in the wall could mean everything. Kira spent the next few hours deliberately blending into the rhythm of the store, but this time her focus sharpened. Every document she touched, every report she skimmed while pretending to clean the desk, every conversation she overheard was a piece of ammunition she was quietly collecting. She didn't need just evidence. She needed context. Numbers only told part of the story. The people told the rest. Lincoln caught up with her in the stockroom around mid-afternoon. His hands were stained with ink from pricing guns, and his shirt had a fresh streak of something sticky down the side. "Thanks for stepping in earlier," he said, his voice low. "Most people just stay out of it?" Kira shrugged, keeping her expression neutral. Seemed like Maya could use the backup. Lincoln glanced toward the front of the store, where Maya was ringing up a customer, her smile small but genuine for the first time all day. "She's been through a lot," Lincoln said. "Debbie's got it out for her, but Maya can't afford to quit. Her mom's in the hospital. Chemo dot." Kira's chest tightened. She knew the facts already from Maya's earlier confession, but hearing it from Lincoln's perspective made it more real. Maya wasn't just a struggling cashier. She was someone fighting for more than a paycheck. The more Kira heard, the more she realized this store didn't just have a toxic culture. It had a story, one of survival, quiet loyalty, and the desperate hope that someday, somehow, things might get better. Later that evening, after the dinner rush died down, Kira made her move. Debbie had left early, something about a family obligation that no one believed, and the store settled into its rare, quieter state. Kira slipped into the office again, this time with purpose. She went straight to the file cabinet marked Weekly Reports. The top folders were pristine, polished versions sent to corporate, but the older ones near the back were sloppier, with handwritten notes crammed into the margins. Kira flipped through quickly, heart pounding harder the further back she went. There it was. An inventory log from 6 months ago, showing a massive markdown adjustment right before a surprise corporate audit. The handwriting wasn't just Debbie's. It matched an earlier memo Kira herself had signed off on from her office. Kira stared at her own signature, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. Debbie hadn't been working alone. She had been playing the system Kira had built, twisting the processes meant to reward success into tools to hide failure. Kira closed the file, her hands shaking slightly. She had come here to fix a broken store. What if the real problem was the woman who built it? Kira placed the file back exactly where she found it, careful not to disturb anything that would tip Debbie off too soon. Her mind was racing, but her hands moved on instinct, sliding the drawer shut with a soft click before she slipped back into the stockroom. Her pulse pounded in her ears, louder than the hum of the ancient fluorescent lights overhead. This wasn't just about Debbie manipulating reports. This was about Kira's own blind spots, her own hunger for fast growth, and how that hunger had left her leadership vulnerable to people like Debbie. She had wanted scalable processes, clean reports, numbers that told a story without the need for messy human nuance. And in doing so, she'd built a system that rewarded manipulation over honesty, a system that had turned people like Debbie into survivors, not leaders. The realization sat heavy in her chest. But guilt wouldn't fix this. Action would. She returned to the floor, forcing herself back into her trainee role, but her senses stayed hyper-alert. She watched the way Lincoln subtly covered for Kelsey when she fumbled a restock, stepping in before Debbie could notice. She saw how Nancy instinctively positioned herself near Maya whenever Debbie walked by, like a human shield formed out of quiet loyalty. This store wasn't surviving because of Debbie. It was surviving in spite of her. Kira found Maya at the end of her shift, sitting on the bench outside the break room, phone in hand, staring at a hospital bill like it might burst into flames if she blinked too hard. Kira sat beside her, not speaking at first, just letting the silence settle between them. Maya finally broke it. "I didn't want to cry at the register," she said softly. "I know it makes me look weak." "You're not weak," Kira answered, her voice quieter than usual. "You're human." Maya shook her head, eyes still on the bill. "Debbie says feelings get in the way of work. That's why she doesn't want anyone too close. Says it makes us soft." Kira swallowed hard, feeling a sharp pang of recognition. Debbie's words sounded eerily close to things Kira herself had once said in leadership workshops, back when she believed efficiency was everything, back when she thought vulnerability was a liability. "Maybe she's wrong," Kira said. Maya looked up, surprised. "Maybe the only reason this place is still standing is because people here do care," Kira continued. "Because you cover for each other. Because Lincoln jumps in to help when he doesn't have to. Because Nancy doesn't quit, even though she probably should have retired already." Maya's eyes softened, her defenses lowering by the inch. And in that moment, Kira saw exactly what she had to do next. Fixing this store wouldn't start with policies or new systems. It would start with earning back something far more fragile: trust. Tomorrow, Kira would stop hiding in the shadows. She would start showing up for her people. Not as Mark the trainee, but as the kind of leader they should have had all along. And that's when Debbie's grip would finally start to break. The store was unusually busy for a weekday morning. A steady stream of customers flowing through the aisles as rain pelted the windows outside. The storm hadn't fully passed, but people came anyway. Some because they needed groceries, others because familiar stores offered a strange kind of comfort when the weather turned gray. Kira stood near the cleaning supplies. restocking shelves with a mechanical rhythm, but her attention stretched far beyond her hands. She was watching everything: the way Maya forced a smile at every customer, the way Lincoln silently fixed displays other people had half finished, the way Nancy hovered like a silent guardian whenever Debbie moved through the store. Debbie had been circling all morning, sharp-eyed and restless. The tension was different today. She could feel something slipping, some invisible hold on the staff, loosening ever so slightly. And Debbie didn't like it. Kira felt it too. The shift wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was there. In the extra seconds Lincoln took to check on Maya between customers, in the way Nancy gave Kira a quiet nod when they passed in the aisle, like they were part of a secret resistance neither of them had openly acknowledged. The moment shattered when a customer at Maya's register raised his voice, loud enough to turn heads across the store. "What do you mean my coupon isn't valid? It's right here." He waved a crumpled paper in the air, his face flushed with frustration. Maya's hands shook as she took the coupon, her voice trembling with every word. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me just check with—" "You don't need to check with anyone," the man snapped. "Do your damn job!" Kira started moving before she could think, but Debbie got there first. "Maya!" Debbie's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Are you incapable of handling a single customer without screwing it up?" Maya flinched hard, her breath coming faster. "Answer me," Debbie demanded, her voice growing louder with every second. I'm trying," Maya stammered, tears already pooling in her eyes. "Trying isn't good enough," Debbie said coldly. "Not when you're embarrassing the whole store." Maya's face paled, her breathing turning shallow and fast. Kira saw her hands start to tremble violently, her shoulders curling inward as if she could somehow make herself invisible. But there was nowhere to hide. Not under Debbie's glare. Not in front of a growing crowd of customers watching like they were rubbernecking a car crash. Then, Maya's knees buckled, and before anyone could react, she crumpled to the floor. For a split second, the store fell completely silent. Then chaos broke loose. Lincoln was the first to move, dropping the case of soda he was holding and rushing toward Maya. "Someone call 911!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the urgency. Customers stepped back, some whispering, others clutching their carts like shields, unsure whether to stay and watch or pretend they hadn't seen. Kira was already kneeling beside Maya, her hand gently pressing against the girl's back as Maya's chest heaved with uneven breaths. Her skin felt clammy, her pulse faint beneath Kira's fingertips. "Maya, can you hear me?" Kira's voice softened, forgetting the disguise entirely. "It's okay, you're safe." Debbie stood frozen, caught between outrage and discomfort, her eyes darting between the fallen cashier and the growing crowd. "She's being dramatic," Debbie muttered, loud enough for people to hear. "It's just a panic attack. Get her some water and put her back on register when she pulls herself together." That was it. Kira's control snapped. She stood up slowly, turning to face Debbie, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice steady. "That's enough." Debbie's brows shot up. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Kira reached up, ripping off the fake name tag pinned to her jacket. "I'm not Mark. I'm Kira Pierce. I own this store, and I've seen enough." The silence was deafening. Customers froze. Employees stood wide-eyed, disbelief flickering across their faces. Debbie's mouth opened, then closed, her usual arsenal of excuses momentarily failing her. Kira didn't wait for her to recover. "You've spent months terrorizing this team." Kira's voice was calm but unshakable. the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. You've manipulated reports, humiliated employees in front of customers, and covered your own failures by blaming the very people keeping this store afloat. Debbie's face reddened. I was following corporate standards. If you have a problem, take it up with... I am corporate, Kira cut in, stepping closer. And I can promise you, what you've been doing has nothing to do with our standards. This isn't leadership. This is fear-mongering. She turned to the employees, her eyes sweeping across Maya still trembling on the floor, Lincoln standing protectively beside her, Nancy quietly watching with a hand over her mouth. And starting today, it ends. For the first time in hours, Kira's pulse slowed. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. All that remained was clarity, the kind that only comes when you finally face what you've been running. Debbie's voice sharpened into a defensive edge. You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything with a speech? This place is a mess because of lazy staff and corporate's impossible expectations. I did what I had to do to survive. Kira's gaze didn't waver. You did what you had to do to keep yourself comfortable, and you did it by breaking the people you were supposed to lead. She glanced down at Maya, then back at Debbie. That ends today. Pack your things. Debbie's face contorted with disbelief, anger, and maybe, just for a second, fear. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious, Kira said quietly. And just like that, the reign of fear in Pierce and Company store number 001 came to an end. The door to the manager's office swung shut with a heavy finality, leaving Kira and Debbie alone for the first time since the truth had detonated in front of the entire store. The muffled hum of employees whispering outside filtered through the thin walls, but inside the room, the silence hung sharp and cold. Debbie stood with her arms crossed, chin lifted slightly, like someone ready for a fight, but not quite sure what weapon to grab first. Kira sat down in the chair across from her, Debbie's chair, taking her time, letting the silence stretch. Debbie cracked first. So this is how it ends, huh? She gave a tight, humorless laugh. You show up out of nowhere, play dress up for a couple of days, and now you think you know everything? Kira folded her hands on the desk, calm but unflinching. I didn't need to play dress up to see what's broken here, Debbie. All I had to do was watch you for 20 minutes. Debbie's jaw tightened, the defensive wall snapping up around her like armor. If you're looking for a villain to blame, fine. Make me your scapegoat. But you're kidding yourself if you think this is all on me. I didn't invent those numbers. I didn't create the pressure to hit targets no matter what. That came from you, the queen of spreadsheets herself. The words landed sharper than Kira expected because there was truth in them. She leaned back slightly, feeling the edge of the desk press into her spine. You're right, Kira said softly. I built the system, but I never told you to break your people to feed it. Debbie's laugh came again, harsher this time. That's easy to say from up there. She gestured vaguely upward, toward where corporate offices would be if they existed in this building. But down here, it's survival. Every bad report puts a target on my back. Every quarter that numbers slip, I'm one call away from being replaced. I did what I had to do to keep this store running and to protect myself. Kira's gaze didn't waver. You weren't protecting the store. You were protecting your ego. Debbie's face reddened, but Kira kept going. Do you even remember when you stopped caring about these people? Because I saw it. The fear in their eyes every time you walked by. They didn't see a leader. They saw someone they had to survive. Debbie's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. Debbie, I'm not saying the pressure wasn't real. I know it was. But somewhere along the way, you decided the only way to survive was to become exactly the kind of manager this company was never supposed to have. That's on me too, but I'm here now, and it stops today. Debbie's arms dropped slowly to her sides. For the first time, her eyes flickered with something dangerously close to vulnerability. Debbie dropped into the worn chair across from Kira, the bravado draining from her posture all at once. For a moment, she just stared at the floor, the sharp edges of her persona crumbling into something raw, something almost fragile. "Do you have any idea what it's like?" she asked quietly, voice stripped of its usual bite. "To build your whole career proving you're tougher than everyone else? To make yourself impossible to replace because the second you show weakness, they'll find someone younger, cheaper, faster?" Kira didn't answer right away, because yes, she knew. Not in exactly the same way, but close enough to feel it in her bones. "I do," Kira said finally. "But toughness isn't the same as cruelty. You didn't have to tear people down to survive, Debbie. You could have brought them with you." Debbie's laugh was bitter. "That's rich, coming from you. You think people see you as some kind of hero? You disappeared into corporate years ago, chasing expansion and headlines. We were down here cleaning up the mess every time a new policy dropped out of nowhere. You built the system that made managers like me inevitable." The truth stung because it wasn't wrong. Kira had spent years building scalable processes, obsessed with turning her small chain into a regional powerhouse. Every decision had been about efficiency, speed, standardization. Along the way, the soul of what Pierce & Co. was meant to be, the store Kira first opened with Nancy at her side, had gotten lost. I made mistakes," Kira admitted. "Big ones. But I'm here to fix them. That starts with making sure the people left standing, the ones who actually care, have the space to lead the right way." Debbie shook her head, shoulders slumping in defeat. "You want my keys? Fine. Take them. But don't pretend firing me fixes this. You can't undo years of fear with a motivational speech." "I know," Kira said. "That's why I'm not here to give speeches. I'm here to work." Debbie stood, pulling her keys from the lanyard clipped to her belt and setting them on the desk. "Good luck with that," she muttered. "They'll never trust you." Kira didn't argue because Debbie might be right. Trust wasn't something you ordered in a staff meeting. It was earned, in every quiet moment, every choice to show up instead of sending an email, every time a leader admitted they were wrong and did the hard work to make it right. As Debbie walked out, Kira stayed seated, fingers brushing the worn surface of the desk. This office, this store, it all started here. And now she had to decide what came next. Through the thin wall, she could hear the staff talking, their voices a mixture of confusion, relief, and lingering fear. Kira stood, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The work of rebuilding Pierce & Company didn't start with a termination. It started now, with showing up, telling the truth, and proving there was a reason to believe again. Kira stood in the center of the sales floor, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, the weight of the room pressing against her skin. The employees, Maya, Lincoln, Nancy, Kelsey, and the handful of others who made up the fractured skeleton crew, stood in a loose semicircle around her. Some leaned on shelves, others crossed their arms protectively over their chests. No one spoke. They were waiting to see what came next, waiting to decide if they should trust her or brace for more bad news. Kira knew the silence wasn't just hesitation. It was survival instinct, the result of years spent under Debbie's rule, where speaking up had consequences and honesty was punished, not rewarded. She had seen this silence before, in boardrooms, in failing stores, even in her own reflection on the days she doubted herself. She took a breath. No speeches prepared, no corporate talking points to lean on, just the truth. I owe all of you an apology. Her voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. The quiet sincerity cut sharper than volume ever could. I built this company. I opened this store. And then I left it behind. Maya shifted her weight from one foot to the other, eyes flickering toward Lincoln, but she said nothing. I thought if I built the right systems, if I wrote the right policies, everything would take care of itself, Kira continued. I thought being a good CEO meant focusing on growth. New stores, new markets, new opportunities, and every time I sent down a new policy or approved a new metric, I told myself it was for the best. But the truth is, I stopped paying attention to what actually matters. She let that hang for a beat, scanning the room, making sure no one could look away. What matters, she said softly, is you. The people who show up every day, who stock the shelves and ring up customers and fix messes you didn't make. I lost sight of that. And because I lost sight of you, I let someone like Debbie take control of this store. That's on me. Nancy's arms slowly uncrossed, hands falling to her sides. Lincoln's brow furrowed like he couldn't quite decide if this was real or some elaborate corporate stunt. I'm not here to pretend that one apology fixes everything, Kira said. I'm not asking you to trust me because of my title. I'm asking you to watch me. Watch how I show up. Watch how I listen. Watch how I work alongside you. And if I don't live up to the promises I make, then you have every right to call me out. Every single one of you. Kelsey shifted forward half a step, eyes wide, caught somewhere between disbelief and hope. And we're not going to fix this overnight, Kira added. But we're going to fix it. Together, if you'll let me. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't fear holding their tongues. It was possibility. For a long moment, no one moved. Kira could feel the weight of their eyes, the doubt curling around the edges of the room like smoke. Trust wasn't built in a speech, no matter how sincere. It had to be earned, word by word, action by action. She knew that. She didn't expect applause or forgiveness. She expected hesitation, and she was ready for it. It was Nancy who broke the silence first. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of every year she'd given to this store. I remember the day you opened this place, Nancy said. You stood outside with your daughter on your hip and told us this would be a family business, one where we took care of each other. She glanced around at her coworkers. Some of us still remember that version of you. But it's been a long time since we've seen her. Kira's throat tightened, but she nodded. I know, and I can't ask you to believe I'm that person again until I show you I am. Lincoln took a step forward, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. So what now? Kira took another breath, grounding herself. Now we rebuild. First, we fill the gaps. We're understaffed, overworked, and running on fumes. That changes today. I'm authorizing immediate hiring for 2 new positions, one for the floor team and one for cashiers. Maya's eyes widened, and Kelsey's hand shot up timidly. Can I help train the new cashier? She asked, her voice almost breaking with nervousness. Kira smiled. Absolutely. Lincoln raised his hand next. And the stockroom position. Can I help with interviews? We need someone who can actually keep up. And no offense, corporate usually hires people who quit after a week. No offense taken, Kira said. I want you involved. There was a quiet shift in the air, something subtle but powerful. The first ripple of ownership returning to the people who actually ran the store. And second, Kira continued, we're rewriting how we do reviews and schedules. No more quotas for the sake of quotas. No more write-ups just to make numbers look cleaner. If there's a performance issue, it's a conversation, not a threat. Maya let out a breath so soft Kira almost missed it. Third, and this one matters most, we're bringing back recognition. Kira glanced at Nancy. You remember the old employee board? The one we filled with customer compliments and little notes from teammates? Nancy's smile was small but genuine. I still have some of those notes in my locker. Good, Kira said, because starting today, we're rebuilding that wall. And every time someone does something right, big or small, we put it up there. This place isn't going to run on fear anymore. It's going to run on respect. For the first time, there was movement. Maya straightened her shoulders. Lincoln stood a little taller, and Kelsey's nervous energy shifted into something closer to excitement. Kira wasn't naive. One meeting couldn't undo years of damage, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was enough to change everything. The next morning, Kira arrived before the sun was up. The parking lot was empty except for Lincoln's car, the same dented sedan she'd seen him pull into the lot every day since she started her undercover shift. She found him in the stockroom, earbuds in, moving with the same quiet efficiency she'd come to expect. She didn't interrupt right away. Instead, she grabbed a box cutter and fell into step beside him, slicing through cardboard while he worked. It wasn't until they were both knee-deep in half-unpacked inventory that Lincoln pulled out one earbud and gave her a sideways glance. So, he said, voice cautious but curious, what happens now? Kira smiled slightly, not looking up from the case she was opening. We rebuild. Yeah, you said that yesterday. But what does it really mean? She set the box cutter down, leaning one hip against the metal shelf. It means you get a voice. It means if something's not working, you say so. And I listen. It means this store runs because of the people in it, not in spite of them. Lincoln's brow furrowed, skepticism still etched into the lines of his face. Managers always say that stuff. Then the next week it's back to business as usual. Kira nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. Then hold me to it, she said. If I slip, call me out. I'm serious. Lincoln studied her for a moment, then gave a small shrug. All right, but if you want to fix this place, you should probably start with Maya. Kira's chest tightened slightly. Why Maya? Lincoln wiped his hands on the back of his jeans. She's been holding this place together, even when she could barely hold herself together. And the only reason she's still here is because she doesn't have a choice. If anyone deserves to know this isn't just some corporate stunt, it's her. Kira nodded slowly, knowing Lincoln was right. Thanks, she said quietly. And Lincoln? You deserve better too. He gave a half smile, small but real. We all do. Later that morning, Kira found Maya in the break room, sitting with her knees tucked to her chest, a half-eaten granola bar resting on the table beside her phone. Hospital bills filled the screen, scrolling endlessly as Maya flicked through email after email. Kira didn't sit across from her this time. She sat beside her, close enough that Maya could feel her presence without it feeling like an interrogation. I know this job hasn't been fair to you, Kira said softly. And I know Debbie made you feel like you were barely hanging on. But I need you to know that's not who you are to me." Maya didn't answer right away. She just stared at the screen a moment longer before finally setting her phone down. "Then who am I?" Kira's smile was gentle. "You're the heart of this place, and I'm really sorry I didn't see that sooner." Maya stared down at her hands, the skin around her knuckles still raw from nervous picking. Kira could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her body had been conditioned to expect bad news whenever someone from management sat too close. But this time, Kira wasn't here to correct her or question her performance. She was here to listen. "I don't feel like the heart of anything," Maya said softly. "Most days I just feel replaceable." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, like saying it out loud made it harder to swallow. "If I called out tomorrow, no one would even notice." Kira shook her head. "That's not true. Lincoln would notice. Nancy would notice. And me? I'd notice most of all." Maya's brow furrowed, her confusion clear. "But you didn't even know my name until this week." "That's on me," Kira admitted. "But I know your name now, and I know your story, the one that actually matters. Not your sales numbers or your override rates. I know you're showing up here every day while your mom's in treatment, and I know you're doing it without ever letting anyone see how scared you are." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly, her defenses trying to rise even as they crumbled. I'm scared if I leave, I'll fall behind on bills, and if I mess up here, I'll lose my hours. There's no safety net." Kira's throat tightened, the weight of her own blind decisions settling heavier on her chest. "That's not okay," she said. "And it's not going to be like that anymore. Starting now, you have paid time off for the rest of this week, and it's not coming out of your hours." Maya's head snapped up. "What? But I can't." "You can," Kira cut in gently. "You're going to take time to be with your mom. I'll make sure you get your full paycheck. And when you come back, you're not just coming back as a cashier. You're going to help me rebuild this place, from the inside out." Maya's mouth opened, then closed, the weight of the offer almost too much to process. "But why me?" she whispered. "Because you see everything," Kira said simply. "You see the problems before they become disasters. You see the customers when they're having a bad day. You see your coworkers when they're too scared to speak up. That's leadership, Maya, even if no one ever gave you the title." For the first time, Maya let a tear slip free, quickly wiping it away with the sleeve of her uniform. "Okay," she said, her voice small but steady. "I'll try." "That's all I ask," Kira said. "You and me, we're going to fix this place together." The break room door creaked open, and Nancy poked her head inside, her expression cautious. "Kira, you have a minute?" "Always," Kira said, standing up. "We're all going to have a lot more minutes for each other from now on." As she followed Nancy down the hall, Kira felt something shift, small but significant. Trust wasn't a light switch. It was 1,000 small choices made every day. And today, they'd made one. Tomorrow, they'd make another. Kira arrived at the store just before opening, not in a suit, not in disguise, but in a simple Pierce & Company uniform polo just like everyone else. The familiar red embroidered logo sat over her heart, a quiet reminder of where this all began. She didn't need a title today. She needed to show up as a teammate. The air inside felt different, not fixed, not healed, but lighter, like the weight of constant fear had started to lift, even if no one fully believed it would last yet. That was okay. Trust wasn't built in a day. Kira knew that now. Nancy was already there, clipboard in hand. But instead of running through checklists like they were gospel, she was talking to people, checking in, asking how their morning was, cracking a joke that made Lincoln snort into his coffee. It was such a small shift, but it rippled through the room. For the first time, the morning meeting didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a team huddle. Kira stood beside Nancy, not at the center, but as part of the circle. "I know we've been through a lot this week," Kira began. "And I know some of you are still wondering if all this talk about change is just that. Talk. I can't blame you for that." No one spoke, but Kira could feel the weight of their eyes. "Prove it," their silence said. "Don't just say it." "So today," Kira continued, "I'm working every department. 1 hour in receiving, 1 hour on register, 1 hour cleaning shelves, you name it. If it's part of running this store, I'm doing it beside you." Lincoln raised a brow, clearly surprised. "You sure you can handle the stockroom? It's a mess back there." Kira grinned. "I've handled worse." They broke the huddle with something close to energy, not excitement exactly, but the cautious optimism of people who wanted to believe things could be better, but were too smart to fall for promises alone. The morning flew by in motion and conversation. Kira worked alongside Lincoln in receiving, stacking boxes, breaking down pallets, and learning firsthand how outdated processes slowed everything down. "Half our time spent fixing mistakes the system shouldn't even make," Lincoln explained, showing her the inventory scanner that glitched every time a product didn't have a shelf tag assigned. "We've been telling management for months, but no one listens." "I'm listening now," Kira said. At the register with Kelsey, Kira helped process a long line of customers, using the downtime between transactions to ask what would make her job easier. Kelsey hesitated at first, unused to being asked, but eventually opened up. "Honestly, just knowing when the schedule's coming out. Debbie used to change it last minute, so I could never plan school stuff." "That stops now," Kira promised. Every conversation added a brick to the foundation Kira was rebuilding. Not with policies, but with presence. And for the first time, her team started to believe she might actually mean it. The afternoon brought a different rhythm, slower between customer waves, but heavier with the kind of quiet work that often got overlooked. Kira spent that time not just working, but watching, really watching, how her team moved through the store when no customers were around to perform for. She saw the way Lincoln automatically straightened displays as he walked past them, even when it wasn't his section. She noticed how Nancy quietly filled end caps with impulse buys, always thinking ahead to what would make checkout faster. She saw Kelsey scribbling ideas for a new seasonal display on the back of a receipt, too shy to show anyone but still dreaming. And she saw how Maya's absence left a visible gap, not just on the schedule, but in the heart of the team. Between restocking and cleaning, Kira dug deeper into the old training files tucked in the office cabinet. They were ancient, stapled handouts from when Pierce and Company first opened. But inside, she found something she'd almost forgotten. A welcome letter she'd written to the very first staff, including Nancy. The paper was yellowed, edges curling, but the words stopped Kira cold. "At Pierce & Co., we believe every person who walks through our doors, customers and employees alike, deserves to feel seen, heard, and valued. This isn't just a store. It's a place where people take care of each other." She'd written those words 20 years ago, and somewhere between Store 5 and Store 12, she'd forgotten them. That afternoon, Kira pulled the old employee board out of storage. Dusty, dented, but still standing. She set it up near the break room, grabbing a pack of sticky notes and a Sharpie. One by one, she wrote down every small act of quiet leadership she'd seen that day. Lincoln fixed inventory tags without being asked. Kelsey created an idea for a seasonal display. Nancy helped train a new hire even though it wasn't her shift. She left the notes pinned to the board without fanfare. No speech, no email announcement, just proof, tangible proof, that she was paying attention. By the time the dinner rush hit, the board was no longer empty. Other notes appeared, some written by Kira, some added by employees who noticed things she hadn't. Kira worked stockroom and didn't complain once. Lincoln helped fix a pricing error before it became a problem. Kelsey stayed late to help clean registers. It was small, but it was real. Near closing, Kira stood at the front doors, holding them open as customers filtered out. Nancy approached quietly, standing beside her with the easy comfort of someone who remembered who Kira used to be and could see glimpses of her returning. "Feels different in here," Nancy said softly. "Feels like home again," Kira answered. Nancy's smile was faint but warm. "We're getting there. Tomorrow would bring more work, more hard conversations, more moments where trust had to be earned again and again." But for tonight, Kira stood in her first store, shoulder to shoulder with her first employee, and knew this was what leadership was supposed to feel like. 3 months later, the store felt almost unrecognizable, not because of some dramatic renovation or flashy corporate rebranding, but because of something much simpler. The people inside it stood taller. Kira stood by the customer service counter, dressed in her regular clothes. No disguise, no corporate polish. Just Kira. She was back in Austin that week, not for a surprise inspection or a performance review, but for something she had learned was far more important. Just to be there. The employee board by the break room had grown so full it needed a second panel. Notes from co-workers to each other, praise from customers, even a few anonymous thank yous. It was messy and uneven, but it breathed. It was proof that people cared, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. At the register, Maya stood confidently, her smile easy and natural as she chatted with a customer about a new product. Her eyes were clear, her hands steady. There were still hard days, Kira knew that. But Maya knew her worth now, and no manager would ever make her forget it again. Kira had personally helped her enroll in a leadership training course the company now offered to all frontline staff. Maya was already drafting ideas for store improvements, and Kira had no doubt some of those ideas would reshape how Pierce and Company operated for years to come. Near the stockroom, Lincoln was giving instructions to a new hire, walking her through how to catch inventory mismatches before they spiraled into bigger issues. His voice carried the confidence of someone who knew his work mattered, not just to his paycheck, but to the health of the whole store. He was officially assistant manager now, but the title mattered far less than the respect he had earned from every single person on that floor. Nancy, the store's unofficial historian and heart, was mentoring the next generation of employees, teaching them not just how to work, but how to care. For the store, for each other, for the customers who had been shopping there since the first day it opened. Kira walked the floor slowly, not because she was inspecting, but because she was remembering. This was what she had always wanted. A place where work didn't just mean survival, where people stayed because they wanted to, not because they were afraid to leave. She paused by the front door, fingers tracing the edge of the glass where her company's name was still etched. Pierce and Company. For years, it had felt like a brand, a logo stamped on reports and tax filings. But standing here, surrounded by people who had reclaimed what it meant, it felt like something else. It felt like a promise she was finally keeping. Kira stepped outside, the early evening air warm and soft against her skin. The sky stretched wide over Austin, streaked with the soft pinks and deep oranges of the kind of sunset you only notice when you finally slowed down enough to look up. She stood just beyond the glass doors, watching through the window as her team, no, her people, moved through the store with purpose and ease. Maya was helping Kelsey rearrange an end cap display. Lincoln was making sure a delivery checklist was updated, and Nancy was sharing a laugh with a longtime customer near the greeting cards. There was no panic, no fear, no desperate attempts to chase meaningless numbers. Just work. Honest, messy, human work. She thought about Debbie for a brief moment. Kira had made sure Debbie received severance and an offer for management coaching if she ever wanted to rebuild her career elsewhere. She didn't wish Debbie ill, but she knew now that Debbie was never the whole problem. The problem was the culture Kira had allowed to take root, a culture that confused fear for discipline and compliance for leadership. That was gone now, replaced by something better. A culture built not on orders from above, but on the quiet, daily choices made by people who gave a damn. Kira reached into her wallet, pulling out something she'd carried with her for 2 decades, a faded Polaroid from opening day. There she was, standing outside the store, her daughter on her hip, and Nancy beside her. All 3 of them smiling with a kind of hope that came from believing they were building something special. For years, Kira had been so busy building more stores that she'd forgotten how to build this store, the one that started it all. But now, as she stood here once again, she knew. Building more didn't matter if you forgot how to care for what you already had. A car pulled into the lot, and Tony Carter, the longtime regular who had witnessed the store's rise and fall, stepped out. He spotted Kira and gave a small salute, like they were old friends sharing a private joke. "Place looks good," Tony said as he approached. Kira smiled. "It feels good." Tony glanced through the window, watching Maya laugh at something Lincoln said. "Never thought I'd see that girl smile behind a register," he said quietly. Kira's smile softened. "She's not just smiling, she's leading." Tony nodded once, hands sliding into his pockets. "Well, welcome back, boss." Kira shook her head gently. "Not the boss today. Just part of the team." She stepped back inside, the glass door swinging shut behind her with a quiet click, the kind of sound that meant nothing to customers but everything to Kira. It was the sound of homecoming, the sound of stepping back into the heart of her own story. She didn't know where Pierce and Company would go from here, what new stores might open, what new challenges might come. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget this floor, these people, this place again. And this time, they would build something worth keeping, together.